Hi, Crystal.
Hello.
Hi. Let me just introduce you first. This is Dr. Crystal Park. She's a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut, and her research focuses on stress and coping, particularly on how people's beliefs, goals, and values affect their ways of perceiving and dealing with stressful events. And a particular note for this series, she was a former president of Division 36 of the APA, the American Psychological Association, and that's the Psychology of Religion division.
And spirituality.
Okay, so they did add spirituality.
They did add, yes.
Great, so that leads me right into my first question. So as a series focusing on the interface of science and spirituality, what was that conversation like when your colleagues were thinking about adding the "and" spirituality to the end of psychology?
It was a long conversation. It took place over a number of years where we were discussing the pros and cons of adding that "and" spirituality piece. Part of it is when you add "and" spirituality, that implies that they're two distinct things. And there were a number of people who felt like spirituality is part of religion, and by separating them, you are kind of making a distinction that they were not sure they wanted to make. And then some people, some of the older generations had some pretty negative connotations to the word spirituality, actually. Sort of akin to spiritualism and some of those kinds of sort of non-scientific constructs. So they didn't like the word spirituality for that reason. And we had a vote that it did not get the 2/3 majority that we needed to change the name. And a few years later, and I don't have the exact years, but then we had another vote, and this time it carried. And I don't know if that was a function of cohorts, a function of just the overwhelming use in the field of the term spirituality. Something changed, and more members were open to adding "and" spirituality. So it was a very interesting conversation, as making that distinction between religion and spirituality is something that has a lot of ink has been spilled on.
Sure.
And still there's no clear consensus or definition that I've seen that people are willing to get on board with. But people keep coming up with what they think is the aha, and then someone else says, no, that's not it either. So I don't know. It's
Right.
Still kind of a lively debate.
So these are complex and multidimensional constructs, and they overlap in all kinds of strange ways, but there does seem to be some difference in the way people use these words, and it seems like that difference has changed, like you were saying, across generations. So you were saying that the older generation, the older cohort, seem to have, in general, a negative connotation with spirituality, whereas now it seems as if it's a wholly positive concept to many younger people. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes. And I think what a lot of people were trying to prevent was people making institutional sorts of religion and the construct of religion sort of one thing, and spirituality this separate thing that's not, could be in conjunction with or separate from. But it seems that that's happened anyway. It's people think about religion now as more of the traditions and the institutions, and spirituality is more of the internal sense. And so I think that's kind of happened. But those are words that keep evolving. So this is probably not where they're going to stay either.
Sure. And I've seen research that some people consider themselves religious but not spiritual.
Right.
And of course, some people consider themselves spiritual but not religious. Many people are religious and spiritual.
Right.
So there's a lot of...
And again, those are things that are changing. And I think among younger generations, it would be you can find people who say they're not spiritual, but I don't think very many people are going to be real excited to endorse I'm not spiritual.
Right.
Yeah.
So people are overwhelmingly spiritual.
Because like you said, that's developed such a positive connotation, like a wholly positive thing. And so what's not to like about spirituality. So who's going to say, they're not spiritual? I mean, I do know people do that, but it's not usual. It's not typical.
Right. So now I know this is a highly charged political issue in your field. Now, do you have a perspective that you've come to when you use the word spirituality in your research? Do you have a go-to definition?
I do not. I use that dissension in the field to sort of play both ends against the middle. So sometimes I'll write religion/spirituality and kind of assume my audience understands that ball of wax, like that those are two things. Sometimes, my colleague Carolyn Alderwin and I had a paper published last year in Psychoreligion Spirituality, where we talked about different pathways that religion versus spirituality would have on health, and sort of proposed religion would be more with a social control kinds of things. So behaviors like smoking and alcohol use might be regulated by religion, or spirituality is more of those internal processes. So kind of going by the way that a lot of people are using those terms now.
Sure.
I can go either way. Yeah, just depends.
Okay.
And I do think when you say religion/spirituality, people understand that, ballpark. So.
Sure. And you did mention, the earlier, the traditions associated with religion and then the social functions. There seems to be this kind of institutional aspect to religion in general that spirituality doesn't necessarily entail.
Right. That is very true. But clearly there's a lot of overlap, still.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And on the other hand, I've heard people talk about spirituality as being potentially negative in that it doesn't inculcate any kind of discipline or regularity in the way that religion kind of insists on.
Right. So by itself, you might say, that's the problem with the term spirituality, is it can shade off into whatever you find sacred, whatever you find holy, whatever you find meaning from, which could be some pretty, most of it's going to be, nature or connection with humanity, but it could start being, I don't know, like stuff that is kind of out there, but that's where people are claiming they're finding their spirituality, and then you might find some negative things in that. I don't have a good example, but it could sort of, some of the things people worship, I don't know, celebrities maybe, or something like that, and or athletic fandom, and maybe some of that's kind of empty or doesn't really lead to the kinds of things that the more traditional spirituality that we're thinking about would.
Right. Even Sam Harris, an avowed atheist, is writing a book about spirituality. So, it's a very nebulous term.
Yeah, yes, it's a very nebulous term.
So hopefully...
It's a very fungible, flexible thing, so, yeah.
Okay, so I like your idea of just pointing to this kind of mess, this definitional mess, without saying too much, but saying, on the other hand, listen, when we say religion/spirituality, we kind of know what we mean here. And of course, these are long traditions, and would you agree that they, in general, have a lot to do with cultivating well-being in people's lives? Would you say spirituality is generally about well-being, besides what else it involves?
It's an interesting question. I know this literature more from the sort of standard religion side of things, and there's Harold Koenig has, a second edition of a very thick handbook of many, many studies that have been done linking religion and to some extent spirituality with all sorts of well-being, everything from mortality, morbidity, cancer, substance abuse, blah, blah, blah.
I think it's right there.
There it is.
Yeah.
And, and that's great. But at the same time, you have to remember that that's not what the purpose of religion is. Like, you don't get religious to get healthy. You get religious because it's where you find your deepest source of meaning, or it's how you understand the world, and that the health benefits are kind of perhaps a side benefit. But the search for the sacred, like Ken Parkerman says, that's really what people are pursuing, and these other things are part of that package or, affiliated, associated with it, but not that that's what it is.
That's interesting. It reminds me of Bertrand Russell's view of happiness, that you can't pursue happiness, that happiness ensues from pursuing something more meaningful.
And I've hypothesized for a while that if you're somebody who doesn't practice regularly and a crisis hits, a health crisis or something like that, and you then reach out and try to be religious or try to be a good Christian or pray for help, that's probably psychologically not nearly as helpful as for someone for whom in good times and in bad times, this is like more of an inherent part of who they are. And then it's there at the ready if they, need it. Just like, cultivating a friendship. You don't cultivate a friendship so that you'll have someone to help you out if you're in trouble, right? And that's not the time to make friends. When you need somebody to give you a ride to the airport, then you start to make a friend. That's not the time, right? And, religion's kind of the same way in terms of how I see it. I haven't really seen that tested in terms of, coping, people drawing on this in times of need when they do or don't have a long-standing set of beliefs and practices. But it does seem to make sense that, and the thing is that, again, that's not why people are religious. They are religious because it is their pursuit of the sacred. My colleague and good friend Ray Paluzzian really hates that term sacred. And in our handbook and some other places, he has really shredded that term. I still find it somewhat useful, but not everybody does. And some people find it very useful. To Ray, it's just another step back. Instead of defining spirituality or religion, now you're defining sacred, and you have the same essential problem.
So you're sort of passing the buck.
But again, we kind of know what it means. This is the same. We kind of know, but it's really hard to pin it down.
So, so there's a few things there. You mentioned the kind of buffering effect that spirituality can have, and not pursuing it as an end unto itself. Mm-hmm. And this idea of knowing what it means, but without being able to say it. I kind of want to focus on the last thing first. Do you think then that spirituality might be ineffable, or do you think that it's just a very fluid term that we're kind of redefining very quickly these days?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an empiricist at heart, so I don't think there's anything we can't, come up with some way to pin it down. But it is it is a changing phenomenon, and I think it's, it's somewhat different for each person, so that makes it that much harder. But I would never say that we can't understand it, because I really think, that we couldn't measure it, that we can't have some good constructs. It's just hard to pin it down.
Okay. So I appreciate your comments about how people don't pursue religion and spirituality for the payout, so to speak, of well-being.
I hope they don't. Maybe, some people do. And there's the old intrinsic, extrinsic, where some people, pursue religion not as an end in itself, but as a means to social standing or social support, or, it's to be part of a community, or because it's expected of you, you get these other goodies. But yeah, I think by and large, there's, people are pursuing it because it has inherent value.
And I think that's an important distinction early on in the field that the public is still integrating and could really benefit from in the discourse, which is the extrinsic versus intrinsic religiosity. Mm-hmm. I know Gordon Allport found that extrinsic religiosity correlated with racial prejudice,
right,
whereas intrinsic religiosity did not, and correlated with the kinds of things that we want it to, like health and altruism and things like that. So right. Does that general distinction still stand in the field? Do you think that the literature still supports it?
Gosh, that's had legs, because we're talking like 50 years ago when he came up with that. And it went through a heyday, and then it went through a period of criticism and neglect, abandonment, and now some people seem to be rediscovering it and saying, that it does have. I mean, if you're looking at motivation, which is what he was looking at, the part of the issue is it serves a lot of functions. So you might be religious primarily because it feels like that's how you connect with, the something beyond yourself. But you also do it because your friends go to church or your friends go to, this meeting, and so you get to hang out with them and get to meet some other people, and maybe you take a leadership position, and they don't necessarily negate one another, and that was part of the problem. And Allport and some others after him talked about it as two distinct and separate orthogonal continua. So you can be high or low on either, and I think that's important to keep in mind, that if you're only doing this for the goodies, for the as a means to other ends, it may not be so healthy. But if it's if you're doing it because it is an end in and of itself, and you get these other things, and I think that's where a lot of the earlier literature got kind of stuck, is trying to sort through that. But I do think that people are kind of coming around to saying, hey, this does have some utility in understanding people's religiousness. So yeah, I would say, yeah, it's kind of in vogue again.
Interesting. So when you say do these things, you talk about going to services and being part of a community or even leadership. Mm-hmm. And I know that you have an interest in studying yoga as well. So I assume you mean those kinds of practices. So it sounds like there's a lot of different aspects here. There's community, there's practices, beliefs come into it at some point. Are there ways to tease those things apart, where you can have beliefs without practices, or community without practices or beliefs, and that kind of thing?
So bigger minds than mine have thought about this, and you probably know about the Fetzer National Institute on Aging initiative that happened in the late 90s.
Right.
But what they did is they convened a bunch of experts at the Fetzer Institute, and they tried to look at the different dimensions of religion, spirituality, and they came up with a measure called the multidimensional measure of religiousness and spirituality. There's a brief multidimensional, the BMMRS is the one that we tend to use. But they talked about a lot of different aspects of religion and spirituality. So beliefs is one, and unfortunately the measure of beliefs there is not really a measure of beliefs. It's not a good measure of beliefs, but they did identify beliefs as important, which I like. They have private religious practices and public religious practices. So those are different, right? So praying by yourself in your bedroom or out in the woods versus in a more public forum, or those have somewhat different meanings and different correlates. And how committed you are, which means how you identify yourself. But commitment is how much time, how much money do you give to these organizations? And money, it's a little problematic because it depends on how much money you have available. So if you give all of your discretionary income but you're poor, that would be less money but more commitment than someone who's very wealthy and gives more but drop in the bucket. But anyway, that's a cool way of thinking about it, right? Like, how much time do you spend pursuing this? How much money do you devote to that? In terms of private, in addition to prayer, there's contemplation or meditation, reading sacred scriptures, watching religious television, which apparently in the South is fairly popular with older adults. And there are, there's a Catholic channel that my mom loved, Catholic stuff day and night. So that's kind of not, so those are all dimensions. I'm trying to think if there's some others that might be relevant. Daily spiritual experience is one of their subscales that's gotten a lot of play just in of itself. Right. So they really kind of like try to pull those apart. They're correlated with each other. Some of the factor analyses have shown, while there's a positive factor, there's the negative factor, like the negative religious coping spiritual struggle piece. But they do seem to be distinct and differentially predictive of different outcomes. So, I think that that's a really important point, is to keep in mind that these things are multidimensional and, and distinct.
Great. So now, before we dive into the well-being piece,
Yes.
Do you think that spirituality is in some way more able to be explored through scientific means, or more able to be incorporated in secular contexts than religion? Or do you
Yes,
think, okay.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, to people, my research pals, a lot of them talk about spirituality even when they're measuring religious concepts like service attendance, because it's more acceptable. Because a lot of, scientifically minded people are like, religion, no. Spirituality, they're like, maybe. So you get a lot more credibility in certain circles talking about spirituality, and you'd get less resistance. So, if you're talking about doing an intervention in a hospital and you want to do a religious intervention, it's not going to fly. What about spirituality? Oh, well, that's very important to medical patients. So, you can kind of like fly under the radar a little bit with the spirituality that you cannot with word religion. It's just too politicized and too polarizing. So yeah, definitely.
Great. So we've been talking at a pretty high level in terms of defining and looking at the field of
Sure.
psychology of religion and spirituality. So I'm going to bring the conversation a little lower for people who are just interested in how spirituality could benefit their lives in some way. And so here at the University of Pennsylvania, we talk about well-being in terms of PERMA, the acronym PERMA. This is Martin Seligman's way of organizing the field. And so P is for positive emotions, E is for engagement, R is for relationships, M is for meaning, and A is for achievement. So I was wondering if we could just go through one element at a time, and if you could sort of just free associate or think of a study that really speaks to that element. Okay, so positive emotions. Positive emotions are things like happiness, joy, love, depending on who you ask. Paul Ekman.
That's another one of those tough words.
Right? Yeah. Paul Ekman says it's not an emotion. Dr. Keltner says it is, and so it's hard to say. Barbara Fredrickson, of course, does a lot of great work on positive emotions, and I would say positive emotions are the part of well-being that probably most people think of first when they think of well-being, or in particular the word happiness. So what comes to mind in the psychological study of spirituality that has to do with positive emotions?
Well, a number of things come to mind. First of all, spirituality is in many ways related to those positive outcomes, like lots of correlational studies, observational studies, longitudinal studies, even some experimental studies where, people doing spiritual practices, the more spiritual they feel they are, the more positive emotions they report. And some interventions that highlight spirituality or have people doing more spiritual practices can produce more of those positive emotions. And then there are some positive emotions that are particularly spiritual. So some people have talked about gratitude as a spiritual emotion, and partly it is. Some people have talked about awe, in particular, AWE, awe,
Right.
and thinking about, you don't necessarily have to believe in God, but having those experiences where you realize the unity of all things, or the connection between you and others. So there's a whole realm of self-transcendent sort of emotions that spirituality can lead people to, probably in a way that not a lot of other avenues do. So. Yeah,
interesting. So, I hear a lot about unity and connection and self-transcendence. They certainly circle the concept of spirituality, and I like that you mentioned that it's not possible, or it's not necessary to have a belief in God to benefit from a lot of these things.
Sure.
So okay, so that's P. E is for engagement, and engagement is being absorbed in something or very interested. Flow is how people talk about engagement a lot. Those times where you're doing something and you look up at the clock and hours have passed. That's the idea of being in flow.
Yes.
So how does spirituality relate to engagement?
So in anticipation of thinking about this particular issue, I was looking at the literature that links spirituality and engagement or flow and finding almost nothing. So this is not something that I think has really been done. So I was thinking about, so spirituality has been linked with mindfulness, right? So I've been thinking about how mindfulness and flow are similar and different from each other. And of course, it comes back to how you would define them. But in mindfulness, you're very aware of the present moment. You're very much tuned into what's happening right now, and the sensations in that moment. You're not judging them. You're not you're just kind of like totally present. And in a way, that's kind of like flow, but in a way, it's kind of the opposite of flow, because in flow, you don't notice time. You kind of like, you're so absorbed in this thing that you're completely unaware of what's going on around you, right? So spirituality is often, especially if you're doing contemplative practices, if you're meditating or engaged in some of the ritual prayer kinds of things, you may be very mindful. Is that engagement?
Yeah, that's very.
I mean, you can ask the folks at University of Pennsylvania what happens with that one. I don't know. I don't know. But maybe they do.
I think it's getting hopefully worked on. I'm working on a paper on this where we situate mindfulness and flow on something called the unitary continuum, which specifically in terms of that self-transcendent element. But what you're talking about is something different, which is the attentional element. What your attention does.
Yes.
And I think it's a good reminder that spiritual practice isn't just one thing. There are hundreds and hundreds of spiritual practices that deal with much different mental and physical processes. So you can imagine one kind of meditation bringing on a state of flow, and another kind mindfulness, and interesting overlaps there.
It is, it's a really interesting question. And so when you kind of link, because spirituality is not the same as mindfulness, just that some of the spiritual practices might lead to mindfulness. But spirituality in general, like how that is related, I really don't know. And I have not seen, I didn't do a super thorough search, but just sort of poking around, I didn't see people making those linkages. So it's very interesting, actually.
That is.
Yeah.
So the next so that was P, E, and R. R is for relationships. And so we talked a little bit about this in terms of religion. What is there in the literature on spirituality that talks about relationships?
Well, there are a lot of intersections, I think, that, so people who are in part of a religious or spiritual community get a lot of social support, a lot of social connection, a lot of socialization outlets through their organizations or through their communities. But in addition to that, there's Annette Mahoney and Ken Pargman have talked about sanctification of relationships and how that really enhances the quality of the relationship. So, for example, if you think about marriage as a sacred bond, and I would include same-sex marriage and like whatever coupling people are making, but if you're thinking about that as something that's not just between you and your partner, but is sanctioned by God, is in God's eyes, or in the community, that sanctification really seems to help people through tough times. They have a lot more, they have more relationship satisfaction, things like that. And you can sanctify you can sanctify friendships, you can sanctify parent-child relationships. So, so that's kind of one of the places I've seen it. A lot of people feel a personal relationship with God. So there is that piece of it. That's kind of more in the religion, probably in the way we're thinking about it, than the spiritual piece. But that's really where I've seen the literature. I haven't seen literature that's just on, some of the other aspects of spirituality that are not tapping into religion, touching on well-being.
Yeah, so the sanctification, it sounds like your colleague, Ray Paluzzian, who didn't like the idea of the sacred, would definitely not like this idea of sanctification.
Well, I think that I don't know how he'd feel about it, because it's not, it just means, what sanctification means is that you just feel that there is this sense that it's bigger than the two of you, that your union is, part of, that there's this extra element of approval or of protection. So I think as a psychological phenomenon, Ray probably would. I don't know. I'd have to ask him, but my guess is he'd probably be okay with that.
So it brings me to the next element of well-being, M, for meaning. Is sanctification and the sacred, could it be seen as a really high degree of meaning? And I know you've done a tremendous amount of work in the area of meaning. So I'll just say the way Marty Seligman thinks about meaning is belonging to and serving something larger than the self, which is a very vague definition. Of
all
course.
These things.
Yeah, again. And I know that you've done a tremendous amount of work in this area and tried to get really clear on meaning. And so I bet you have all kinds of things to say about how meaning relates. But what comes to mind in terms of a simple takeaway? Or is there one?
Well, I talk about global meaning and situational meaning. So global meaning is the sort of big picture. Situations is meaning applied in particular situations. So like, sanctification is a specific example of people adding an additional layer of meaning to their relationships. It's not just I love this person, but I love this person in the context of, that this is what we're supposed to do, and this person is, that our union is special and approved of by someone besides us. So that's just that kind of situational meaning. We go back to global meaning, the bigger sort of picture meaning. Some people call that existential meaning, which is what you're referring to in the PERMA model. That it's interesting because some people consider meaning as a predictor of well-being. So you have to have a lot of meaning in life, then you're not depressed. You have to have a lot of, high meaning, low suicidality, high meaning, low substance abuse, high substance use, low meaning. There's that connection between a high sense that my life is meaningful, that I have purpose, that I matter, that I understand the world. Those are the three components of global meaning that we talk about. Is in a subjective sense of meaning is the world makes sense, it's predictable, it's understandable. That's the comprehension piece. The purpose, I feel like I'm working on things that are important, that I'm making good progress towards my goals. That's the purpose piece. And that I matter. In the scheme of the universe, I'm small and it's huge, but I matter. I matter to other people, and the fact that I live and the fact that I have lived will be important in the big scheme of things. So the mattering piece. So there's those three pieces. And we think of those as predictors of well-being, not so much that is well-being. But back to your question of how is spirituality related to those things? Massively related. So some people consider meaning in life to be spirituality. So if you consider that the predictor and the outcome, then it is just sort of inherently there, right? But even, looking at other things like meaning, sort of more traditional religiousness and meaning, you see strong linkages between all three parts of that people feel like they matter, or that people feel like they have purpose, that people feel like they understand the world, or even if they don't, someone else does, and they can kind of, have secondary control through that. So very, very strong connections. If you're thinking more about, spirituality as related to meaning in life, that a lot of people do find their purpose and their sense of making a difference in the world through their spirituality, that kind of keeps them grounded. So, that's where I see the most connection in the work that's been done. There's just been a lot of it.
Wow, I'd love to have you on just to do a whole episode on meaning. That's an incredibly rich answer, and so maybe we'll have a link of some of your work on this that we can direct
Sure.
viewers to,
Right.
Because that's great. So that's PERM. So PERMA, the last A is for accomplishment or achievement.
Uh-huh.
That's an interesting one for spirituality, especially in light of what you were talking about earlier in terms of taking kind of a non-teleological approach, or not just practicing spirituality to get the benefits from it. But there does seem to be some difficult practices and retreats and discipline involved in spirituality that I could imagine having to do with accomplishment. And I guess there is a kind of magical thinking that some people, kind of engage in that I don't know if that would be considered spirituality. That the idea of, sort of imagining something and having it come true. I'm curious as to what direction you'll take the accomplishment.
Wow. Okay. So I was thinking about the A in PERMA as more traditional, the way that our culture defines it as sort of career success, or those kinds of things. So you could start with the Protestant work ethic. That there is that sort of like way back there.
Sure.
There's a lot of really cool work on self-regulation and how religion and spirituality, that model that I mentioned earlier on health, that we were thinking that religion and spirituality really help people regulate their impulses, so they may be less likely to have negative affect and all the sequelae of that, and to use fewer negative health behaviors as ways of regulating their bad moods, because people tend to overeat and smoke and drink, So that self-regulation piece, though, so religion gives all sorts of guidelines for how to live your life, and what to do when you have a crisis, and how not to be so depressed, and where to turn for help. And it provides lots of resources. So all these sorts of self-regulatory things can help people to stay on the right track, sort of broadly speaking.
Sure.
I was thinking about it more in the traditional achievement accomplishment. And the thing that I was thinking about is there's a ton of work and interest now by corporations on spirituality in the workplace. Like there's journals, there's books, it's huge. Like people are really wanting this because people do. And if you make your employees more happy, they produce more widgets or whatever. And so there's a real hunger in the workplace for spirituality. So there's a lot of people out there making good money providing these, consultations to organizations and writing books about it and that kind of thing. That's not where I go, but it's cool that it's there, that people are doing this.
There's it seems like there's a sinister and there's a charitable interpretation of what's going on there.
You can draw your own conclusions, but but there's this some people doing Brian Dick and some other folks doing this stuff on calling, right? So there's a lot of interest in people finding the right path. The Buddhists, talk about Dharma, people finding their path, and that is very consonant with their spirituality. So it's calling them to do a particular mission. It might not be like going into the clergy. It might be, to be a nurse or to be a police officer or whatever, but you're providing a service that feels like you're being called, you're being directed, you're listening to your inner self. Is that God or just your own higher being telling you, drawing you in this direction?
Sure.
But regardless, and there's work that shows that people are much more satisfied with whatever career it is they're doing if they feel like it is a calling, that it is, helping them, maximizing what they are able to do and offer the world. That makes sense.
Yeah. So people are going to feel like you're a plant, or I told you to say this because I don't know if you know this, but I just put together a book on callings, and Brian Dick is one of our contributors.
I really.
So I'll send you a copy. But thanks for the impromptu.
Sure. A little plug for your book.
Yeah.
No worries.
So, as we're finishing up here, I just wanted to ask you what aspects, if any, of spirituality, and, as we've talked about this being a multidimensional construct involving beliefs and community and rituals and practice, all kinds of things. So is there any aspect of spirituality that brings you well-being in your own life that you wouldn't mind talking about?
Well, I think the beliefs part, like a lot of people talk about spirituality or religiousness in terms of behaviors and motivation, in terms of affect, emotion, and then in terms of the beliefs. And the cognitive piece has really gotten short shrift in the literature. And like I mentioned, that measure that says it's on beliefs it's not. And so there's like beliefs in God, beliefs in an afterlife, but also lots of beliefs about the nature of humans, what we're supposed to do, how do you define good and bad? How do you make decisions? Like there's all these like cognitions that really have not been very well studied. And I think that there's a huge richness in that provides that can provide a sense of well-being. It can also create lots of spiritual struggle, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
But I think for me, cultivating more of the beliefs in, you mentioned the yoga, and I know I am trying to be a yogi and sort of follow some of the philosophies of yoga, and it provides a lot of perspective for me, and kind of keeps me grounded. Just the fact that it can get real deep real quick, but just that that things are illusory, they're not as they seem, they're ever changing, and that all of our suffering is from our struggle to attach and to hold on to and to cling. And it sounds real easy. All you need to do to stop suffering is let everything go. Just let everything run through you and don't hold on to anything. And it's hard to do.
Sure.
It's impossible to do as a human, but you strive for that. And that has been enormously helpful for me in the past few years, and some of the life challenges that I've had to face. And I know there's obviously, if you're still alive, there's more bad stuff in the future. Just to embrace some of those perspectives that have been around for thousands of years. And I really haven't studied the yoga scriptures in a lot of depth, but I do absorb some of that. And I also have a physical practice, an asana practice that also I think really helps to keep me grounded. So, yeah.
Wow, great. So the cognitive piece that you mentioned, different beliefs about the world, reminded me of when we met, which was at Jer Clifton's research retreat.
Yes, 1 year ago.
Right, yeah. And I'm using his desk actually right now to hold up the laptop. And so hopefully he'll have some great research coming out in the very near future.
I think he will.
Yes, I think so too. And also you mentioned your yoga practice, which of course is just really blooming in the United States and in Europe. And do you have any new research coming out in that area that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, yeah, funny you should mention that. So we've been working on a sort of way of characterizing yoga interventions that sort of dismantles. The project is, what is yoga? really, essential properties of yoga. And we've been studying this for the last 5 years. We have a grant from NIH to sort of look at what people think about the essential properties of yoga. So the philosophy is part of it, and the asana practice, and the meditation, and the concentration, and the social aspects. And, so we're kind of like looking at that, the idea being that then we can say certain kinds of interventions have certain kinds of effects, because yoga is so vast and so broad, and some yoga is just kind of sitting and meditating, and some yoga is extremely physical and sweaty, and there's no mention of spirituality, and then there's everything in between. Right. And so we're really trying to look at whether certain kinds of yoga might produce different kinds of effects, and in combination or separately for different kinds of problems that people have, or different kinds of growth that they want to experience. So I'm very excited about that project. It's something we have just poured ourselves into for the last 5 years, and we're on the last phase, so we're going to be doing some validation of the measure. So I'm very excited about it.
That's extremely exciting. So please keep us posted, and I'll mention when it comes out.
Yes, thank you.
Really
Great.
Interesting.
Will do.
So thanks so much for joining us and talking about all of your work and your ideas on this topic. I mean, so many of these concepts are so vague and so broad, and yet they matter so much to so many people. And
they do. Well, yeah, there's nothing more central to being human, I think. I just think it's basic. So I'm really glad you're doing this, and I'm really honored to be asked to be part of it. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, and I'll talk to you very soon.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.